Close your eyes and picture this. You're about to wake up in a medieval village. Not your cozy, climate-controlled bedroom with blackout curtains, but a creaky little wooden hut with straw stuffed in the cracks to keep the wind out. The bed underneath you is a bundle of hay, itchy enough to make your back regret every decision that led you here. The blanket is scratchy wool, the kind that makes you want to sneeze just by looking at it. And if you're lucky, the mattress doesn't have too many bugs crawling around in it. Congratulations, you survived the night. But now comes the fun part, waking up. Except, here's the thing. There is no alarm clock. No phone buzzing with its cheerful little ringtone. No snooze button to smack half asleep. Instead, the medieval alarm system is nature. The sun. The rooster in the yard. Or maybe your neighbor outside yelling at their donkey because it wandered into their vegetable patch again. In fact, in many villages, the rooster was the official wake-up call. It didn't care if you wanted an extra 20 minutes of sleep. It crowed when the sun peeked over the horizon. Imagine that. Your alarm isn't set by you, but by a bird. And unlike your phone, you can't turn it off. At best, you could chase it away. But then you just have an angry chicken, and no one needs that before breakfast. And forget the idea of sleeping in. Medieval life was built around daylight. When the sun came up, so did you. Why? Because you had work to do, and you only had so many hours of light to get it done. There were no lamps you could flick on with a switch. Candles and torches were expensive, smoky, and not exactly bright. Once night fell, your productivity fell with it. So wasting daylight was a terrible idea. Now, here's a little fun fact. In medieval Europe, people didn't even sleep in the same way we do now. Modern folks usually go for one long stretch of sleep, 7 or 8 hours if we're lucky. But back then, people often slept in 2 chunks. They had something called first sleep and second sleep. You'd go to bed soon after sunset, sleep for a few hours, then wake up in the middle of the night. Some people would pray, some would chat quietly, some might even sneak in a little work or, let's be honest, visit their neighbors. Then, after an hour or two, they drift back into second sleep until dawn. Sounds cozy, right? Except it wasn't. Imagine waking up in a cold, drafty house, fumbling in the dark because the fire went out, and then trying to convince yourself to go back to bed. The medieval world was not exactly built for insomniacs. And don't forget, if you had animals, you might have to check on them even in the middle of the night. Nothing says sweet dreams like trudging outside in the freezing dark to make sure your cow didn't knock over the fence. So, when the rooster crowed or the sunlight hit your face, you didn't groan and roll over, you got up because you had no choice. The farm wouldn't run itself, the bread wouldn't bake itself, and the fields wouldn't plow themselves. Sleeping in was basically a luxury reserved for the sick, the elderly, or maybe the nobility, though even they had servants waking them early to get on with the day. And let's not forget, your bedroom was not private. Most peasants lived in one-room houses. That meant your parents, your siblings, maybe even your grandparents, and possibly a goat or chicken all shared the same space. If one person or animal woke up, chances are everyone did. So picture it. You're trying to snooze for another 10 minutes, but your little brother is poking you because he's cold, the cow is mooing, and someone just dumped a log on the fire that sends smoke everywhere. Not exactly the relaxing morning routine we know today. Now, maybe you're thinking, all right, fine, I'll just stay under the covers and pretend I didn't hear the rooster. But that straw mattress isn't exactly the kind of soft memory foam cocoon that begs you to stay. It's lumpy, scratchy, and smells faintly of mildew. Not to mention, you're probably sharing it with another family member, or 3. Privacy? Forget it. Your bed is basically a communal nest. And don't even think about scrolling TikTok for a few minutes before starting your day. The closest thing you'd get to that was staring at the wooden beams in the ceiling, wondering if today's the day one of them finally cracks. So, would you survive the medieval wake-up call? Maybe, but you wouldn't enjoy it. Your body would miss the alarm you complain about now. You'd long for that snooze button. And by the time you dragged yourself up, stretched your aching back, and tried to shake the straw out of your hair, you'd realize something very important. The hardest part of your day hasn't even started yet. Because in the medieval world, getting up was just the beginning. So, You've managed to wake up in medieval Europe. The rooster crowed, the sun crept through the cracks in the wooden shutters, and you dragged yourself out of that scratchy straw bed. Congratulations, you survived the morning alarm system. But don't get too comfortable. Now comes the question, what's for breakfast? Here's where your modern brain might start to panic. You're probably imagining a nice plate of eggs, some crispy toast, maybe a cup of coffee with just the right amount of sugar. If you're feeling fancy, maybe pancakes or oatmeal with fruit. Well, sorry to disappoint you, but medieval breakfast was not a feast. In fact, for a lot of people, it wasn't even really a meal. For peasants, breakfast usually meant one thing, more bread, and you guessed it, bread. And not the soft, fluffy bakery kind that comes sliced and wrapped in plastic. This was coarse, heavy bread baked with barley, oats, or rye, whatever grains were available. It was dense, filling, and tough enough to double as a doorstop if you needed it. You might dunk it in something to just soften it, like ale, milk, or maybe a thin soup if you were lucky. Speaking of ale, here's something that might surprise you. In the Middle Ages, people drank beer or ale with breakfast. Yes, really. But before you imagine everyone stumbling into the fields tipsy before noon, let's clarify. This wasn't your modern strong craft beer. Medieval ale was usually pretty weak, closer to a light beer or even watered-down malt. It was safer than drinking water, which could be contaminated with all sorts of unpleasant things. So for them, ale was basically their version of coffee. It got you started in the morning and kept you hydrated. Now, if you were lucky enough to live near cows or goats, you might have some milk. But milk spoiled quickly, and refrigeration didn't exist. Fresh milk was mostly for children or turned into cheese as fast as possible. So don't count on pouring yourself a big glass to go with your bread. And what about eggs, you ask? Well, eggs were available, but they weren't an everyday thing for peasants. Chickens were valuable for more than just their eggs. They provided meat when needed, and their eggs could be sold or traded. If a family ate eggs for breakfast, it probably wasn't every day. For most common folks, the idea of bacon and eggs sizzling in a pan just didn't happen. In fact, breakfast itself wasn't even considered important by many. Some people just skipped it altogether and went straight to work, saving their appetite for a midday meal.
So if you're used to grabbing a hearty breakfast sandwich on the way to work, medieval mornings would feel painfully empty. But let's imagine you're not a peasant. Maybe, just for fun, you woke up in a castle instead. Surely the nobles ate like kings, right? Well, not exactly. Sure, their bread was finer, made from wheat rather than barley, and maybe they had some cheese, eggs, or even a bit of cold meat. But even nobles didn't treat breakfast as a grand affair. For many of them, the day started with bread, cheese, maybe a bit of wine or watered-down ale. In fact, some medieval doctors even advised against eating early in the morning, saying it was bad for your health. Imagine that, medical advice to skip breakfast centuries before intermittent fasting became trendy. And one more heartbreak for you. No coffee. None. Coffee didn't really make its way into Europe until much later, and even then, it was an exotic luxury. So if you rely on that morning cup of coffee to transform from a sleepy zombie into a functioning human being, medieval life would be cruel. The best you could do was splash some cold water on your face and chew through a hunk of bread. Let's also talk about sugar, or rather, the lack of it. Sugar was a rare and expensive import, not something you sprinkled on cereal. Honey was the main sweetener, but that too was precious. So your breakfast porridge, if you had any, wasn't sweetened with cinnamon and brown sugar. It was more likely a bland mush of oats or barley, maybe with some onions or herbs tossed in if you were feeling fancy. Porridge in the medieval world was practical, not Pinterest-worthy. Now, let's set the scene. You're sitting on a rough wooden stool, maybe by the fire if it's cold. In front of you is a wooden bowl with some leftover stew from last night, reheated because nothing goes to waste. You have a chunk of bread in your hand, and you're dunking it in the stew to soften it. Maybe there's a piece of cheese if the cow was generous yesterday. You wash it down with a mug of weak ale. That's breakfast. No colorful fruit, no golden waffles stacked with syrup, no buttery croissant. Just simple, heavy food designed to keep you working until the sun is high. And if you're really unlucky, there's no breakfast at all. Famines and poor harvests were common. Sometimes the fields didn't yield enough or grain stores ran low. In those times, people skipped meals regularly, and breakfast would be the first to go. Starting your day hungry wasn't unusual. So, would you last through a medieval breakfast? Maybe, but you'd miss your coffee within the first 5 minutes. You'd chew on that tough bread and wonder why anyone ever thought this was a good idea. You'd stare longingly at the thought of eggs, bacon, or a sweet pastry. And when someone handed you a mug of ale at 6 in the morning, you'd probably raise an eyebrow, but then you'd drink it anyway, because water wasn't safe. And that's the real medieval breakfast of champions. Bread, ale, maybe cheese if you're lucky. It wouldn't make you feel full of energy, but it would keep you alive. And in the Middle Ages, that was all that really mattered. So now that you've powered through your morning meal, or lack thereof, it's time to get on with your day. Don't get too excited, though. The real medieval routine is about to hit you. And let's just say it doesn't involve checking emails or sipping lattes. So, you've survived the medieval wake-up call, and you've forced down that delicious breakfast of bread and ale. Good job. Now comes the next part of your day, the morning routine, or more accurately, the lack of one. Because if you think you're about to stroll into a bathroom, turn on the hot shower, and lather up with a bottle of lavender-scented body wash, I have bad news for you. In the Middle Ages, the concept of hygiene was, let's call it, minimalist. People did wash, but not in the way we're used to. For most peasants, washing meant splashing a bit of cold water on your face from a wooden bucket, maybe rinsing your hands if you were about to handle food. Soap, if you even had it, was rough stuff made with animal fat and lye. It worked, but it wasn't exactly gentle on your skin. Imagine scrubbing your face with a bar of gritty, scratchy soap that smells faintly like old sheep. Refreshing, right? Toothpaste didn't exist, at least not the minty kind. Some people rubbed their teeth with cloth or chewed on twigs or used mixtures of herbs and ashes. If you were lucky, your breath smelled like rosemary. If you weren't, it smelled like last night's onions. And toothbrushes as we know them? Forget it. Dental hygiene was a do-it-yourself project with varying results. Cavities were common, and dentists were, well, let's just say you didn't want to visit one. Now, deodorant. Spoiler alert, there wasn't any. People sometimes carried little pouches of herbs or flowers to sniff when things got too smelly, but that was about it. Baths did exist, but they weren't daily. In fact, most peasants might only bathe a few times a year. Yes, you heard that right, maybe once a season. Nobles sometimes bathed more often, but even then it wasn't a daily habit. Water had to be hauled, heated, and poured into tubs. It was time-consuming, expensive, and honestly, people didn't think being squeaky clean was necessary. So when you step outside your house in the morning, the air smells different. You've got the aroma of animals, because many families kept their goats, pigs, or chickens inside the house or right outside the door. Add in the smoke from hearth fires, the mud of unpaved streets, and the not-so-delightful contributions of chamber pots being emptied into ditches. Altogether, it's a scent you can't capture in a candle. And trust me, you wouldn't want to. Speaking of mud, let's talk about the roads. Paved streets were rare outside of big cities, and even those were uneven and messy. For most villages, the roads were just dirt paths. When it rained, and it rained often, they turned into rivers of mud. People walked through it in leather shoes or simple wooden clogs, which didn't do much to keep the muck out. Forget sneakers or waterproof boots. If you were lucky, your shoes lasted a season before falling apart. And no, you couldn't just pop into a store for new ones. Shoes were handmade and expensive. Many peasants went barefoot. So picture this. You step outside in the morning, your shoes already soggy, the smell of smoke and manure in the air, and the cold wind cutting through your wool tunic. There are chickens pecking at the mud, dogs barking, and your neighbor's pig rooting around in a pile of scraps. And you, the modern traveler, are shivering and wishing for a hot shower and a pair of socks that aren't filled with mud. And even if you were noble, things weren't much better. Castles were drafty stone fortresses, not cozy palaces. The stone walls kept out invaders, sure, but they also kept out warmth. Fires blazed in the hearth, but most of the heat just vanished up the chimney. So unless you were sitting right next to the flames, you were cold. And because glass windows were rare and expensive, most homes had wooden shutters or oiled cloth to cover the openings. Drafts slipped through easily. So even the wealthy woke up to chilly mornings, smoky air, and damp clothing. Now, let's talk about laundry. Clothes weren't washed often. Peasants owned maybe 1 or 2 sets of clothing, usually made from wool or linen. Washing meant scrubbing garments by hand in cold water, often with ashes or harsh soap, and then drying them in the open air. It was exhausting work.
So, people wore the same clothes for days, sometimes weeks. If you think you feel gross wearing the same t-shirt 2 days in a row, try a medieval tunic for a fortnight. So, what did all this mean for your morning routine? Well, you didn't have one. Not really. You got up, maybe splashed your face, grabbed whatever you needed for the day, and got moving. No 10-step skincare routine, no hair dryer, no cozy robe. If you wanted to brush your hair, you might use a wooden comb. If you wanted to smell better, maybe you tucked a sprig of mint into your pocket. But most of the time, you just accepted the dirt, the smell, and the cold as part of life. And the funny thing is, people didn't think of themselves as dirty. For them, this was normal. Everyone smelled, everyone wore the same clothes, everyone had muddy shoes. It was just the way the world worked. No one was walking around thinking, wow, I really need some deodorant. They were too busy trying to survive. So, here you are, standing in the middle of your medieval village, mud squishing under your feet, cold air nipping at your ears, and the faint smell of goats wafting by. You miss your shower. You miss your toothpaste. You miss clean socks. And the day hasn't even properly begun. Because now, after your morning routine, it's time to face the real work. And trust me, you're not ready for it. So, you've stumbled through your medieval morning routine. You're cold, you're muddy, and you're already regretting every life choice that brought you here. But before you head out for the day, there's one more problem to face: your clothes. And let me tell you, medieval fashion was not designed with comfort in mind. Or style, really, unless you think itchy wool potato sack is the next big look. Let's start with the peasants, since that's where most of us would have been. Forget jeans and t-shirts. A medieval peasant's outfit was usually a simple tunic, basically a long shirt that reached the knees or calves, made out of wool or linen. Over that, you might wear another layer in colder months and maybe a cloak if you were lucky. Linen was scratchy, wool was itchy, and washing was rare. So whatever you put on in the morning, you'd be wearing for days, maybe weeks. Colors? Don't expect much. Dyes were expensive, so peasants stuck with earthy tones, browns, grays, dull greens, nothing that would pop on Instagram. You wouldn't be showing up in a bright red tunic unless you wanted people to think you stole it. Shoes were another adventure. Most were made of plain leather, thin-soled and barely held together. Waterproofing didn't exist, so once they got wet, and they always got wet, they stayed soggy for hours. You could try stuffing straw inside to keep your feet warm, but it wasn't exactly cozy. And if your shoes wore out, good luck. Shoes were expensive, and many peasants just went barefoot. Imagine walking through a muddy, freezing, animal poop-covered street with no shoes. That was normal. Now, if you were a noble, things were a little fancier, but not necessarily more comfortable. Wealthy men and women wore layers upon layers of fabric to show off how much cloth they could afford. Rich colors like deep reds, blues, and purples were reserved for those who could pay for expensive dyes. Velvet and silk showed wealth, but wearing them wasn't like slipping into pajamas. It was heavy, stiff, and often impractical. And let's not forget shoes for nobles. Pointed shoes were all the rage at one point. The longer the point, the higher your status. Some of them got so long they had to be tied to the leg with little chains just to keep people from tripping over them. Stylish, maybe. Practical? Absolutely not. Imagine trying to walk to work in clown shoes, and you'll get the picture. Now, you might be wondering about undergarments. Peasants wore simple linen shirts and maybe some basic underclothes. But here's the thing. Laundry was hard, and underwear was not changed daily. You wore the same set until it was too dirty to handle. Washing meant hauling water, boiling it, scrubbing by hand, then drying in the sun. It was exhausting, so most people just didn't bother often. And don't get me started on armor. You've probably seen movies where knights strut around in shining steel plates, looking like superheroes. But the reality, armor was heavy, like 40 to 60 pounds heavy. Walking in it was awkward, fighting in it even worse. And taking it off? You needed help. If you woke up in medieval times thinking you'd just throw on a suit of armor and look cool, you'd collapse within 10 minutes. For women, fashion came with its own struggles. Peasant women wore long wool dresses with aprons, practical but heavy. Noble women wore gowns that dragged on the floor with long sleeves that dipped into everything: food, mud, fire. Some dresses even required servants to help you put them on. And let's not forget about corsets and tight lacing, which weren't comfortable at all. And the laundry problem? Even worse with fancy clothes. Rich fabrics were delicate, easily ruined, which meant noble clothes often smelled just as bad as peasant clothes, only they looked nicer. Here's another fun fact. In many villages, people made their own clothes. Spinning thread, weaving fabric, sewing tunics, it all took hours of labor. Clothes were so valuable that when someone died, their garments were passed down, patched up, and worn again. Imagine inheriting your grandpa's itchy old tunic and being expected to wear it proudly. So, let's imagine you, the modern time traveler, standing in your new medieval outfit. You're wearing a wool tunic that scratches your arms, leather shoes that already have holes, and a cloak that smells faintly of smoke and sheep. You feel heavy, stiff, and uncomfortable. And the worst part? This is your best outfit. There's no clean pile of clothes waiting in your closet. No sneakers, no sweatpants, no soft hoodie. What you're wearing is what you've got. For weeks. So, yes, fashion in the Middle Ages made a statement. But the statement was less, I look amazing, and more, I'm itchy, cold, and my shoes are falling apart. And now that you're dressed, if you can call it that, it's time to step outside and face the day, which means stepping out of your drafty little hut into the mud and heading to your next medieval challenge. And trust me, it's not a catwalk. All right, so you've got your medieval outfit on, it's itchy, your shoes are already muddy, and you're still hungry because that piece of bread at breakfast didn't really hit the spot. But before you head off to work in the fields or the market, let's pause for a moment and look around the place you actually woke up in, your medieval home. Now, the word home today makes us think of warmth, comfort, and safety. Maybe a couch, a TV, some cozy blankets, and walls that actually keep out the cold. But in the Middle Ages, a house was less about comfort and more about survival. Think of it like a glorified shed that you and your entire family, and possibly some animals, squeezed into.
The walls of your house were usually made of wood, mud, or wattle and bab, a mixture of sticks, clay, and straw. Strong enough to stand, but not exactly soundproof or insulated. When the wind blew, you felt it. When it rained, water often dripped in. And when it snowed, well, you bundled up in your itchy wool cloak and hoped for the best. The roof was often thatched, bundles of straw or reeds layered together. It worked, but it wasn't perfect. Birds sometimes nested in it. Bugs lived in it. And if the roof caught fire, and roofs did catch fire, your house was basically gone in minutes. Fire safety regulations? Non-existent. Inside, The floor might be wood, if you were lucky, but for many peasants, it was just packed dirt. That's right, a dirt floor. Sweep it all you want. It's still dirt. Add in the mud from outside, animal messes, and spilled food, and you could imagine what it looked like. Rugs? Carpets? Forget it. At best, you threw some rushes or straw on the ground to cover the smell. But that straw quickly got filthy, so it had to be changed regularly. Now let's talk about the bed. We already touched on this, but let's revisit the nightmare. The mattress was a sack stuffed with straw or hay. It wasn't fluffy, it wasn't soft, and it definitely wasn't bug-free. Fleas, lice, and bedbugs were a normal part of medieval life. You didn't have a pillow-top mattress, you had a lumpy sack that poked you in the ribs, and you shared it with your spouse, your children, and maybe your siblings. Privacy didn't exist. Everyone just piled in together for warmth. If you were slightly better off, you might have a wooden frame for your straw mattress, instead of sleeping directly on the floor. But don't imagine a nice four-poster bed. It was crude, creaky, and uncomfortable. And the blankets? Heavy wool, sometimes patched together from old clothing. Warm, yes. Soft? No. Now, if you were a noble, your house looked a little different, but don't get jealous yet. Nobles lived in castles or manor houses. Sounds fancy, right? In reality, castles were cold, damp, and drafty. Stone walls kept out invaders, but also trapped moisture. Fires smoked up the rooms, windows were just holes covered with wooden shutters. Or if you were wealthy, thin sheets of horn or oiled cloth that let in light, but not much warmth. Glass existed, but it was extremely rare and expensive. Even in a castle, you weren't exactly cozy. You might have a private bedchamber, sure, with a big bed and thick curtains to keep out drafts, but rats still ran along the floors, fleas still bit at night, and the chill of stone walls never went away. In winter, you could sleep right next to the fire and still see your breath in the morning. Lighting was another issue. Forget electric bulbs. Candles were expensive, so peasants relied on the fire in the hearth for light. Nobles had more candles, but even then, the light was dim and smoky. Imagine trying to read or sew by the flicker of one candle. Your eyes would ache after 5 minutes. And the smell? Oh, the smell. With animals indoors, chamber pots tucked in corners, smoke from the fire, and no ventilation, the air inside a medieval house was thick. You get used to it eventually, but the first time you stepped inside, you'd wrinkle your nose. So, was home sweet home? Not really. Home was more like a shelter, a place to stay alive rather than a place to relax. Forget your cozy bed, your Netflix, your scented candles. A medieval home was cramped, smoky, noisy, and drafty. You shared it with your family, your animals, and whatever bugs decided to move in. And here's the kicker. After a long day of work, this was the place you came back to. The place you were supposed to rest. It wasn't restful, but it was what you had. And medieval people, tough as they were, just accepted it. So now you've seen the inside of your medieval home. Not exactly inviting, is it? And yet this was life for millions of people. They didn't complain about the lack of throw pillows or central heating. They just got on with it. Because in the Middle Ages, survival came first, comfort came second, if at all. And with that in mind, it's time to step back outside. Your day's waiting for you, and it's about to get harder. So, you've survived breakfast, you've survived your itchy clothes, and you've even survived the fact that your home feels more like a barn with a roof. Now it's time to do what every medieval person had to do. Work. And spoiler alert, you're not going to like your job. In our modern world, people complain about their office jobs, about answering emails, about endless meetings that could have been handled with a text. But compared to medieval work, office life looks like paradise. At least in the office, you have a chair, a roof, and maybe even free coffee. In the Middle Ages, you had none of those. If you were a peasant, and remember, most people were, you worked the land. Farming wasn't a choice, it was survival. You were up at dawn, grabbing your wooden tools, heading out to fields that didn't care if you were tired, sick, or hungry. Plowing, planting, weeding, harvesting, It was non-stop, back-breaking labor. And the kicker? Even after all that work, most of your crops didn't belong to you. They went to your lord, the church, or taxes. You kept just enough to keep your family alive. Let's imagine you're out in the fields, hoe in hand. The sun is beating down, your back hurts after 10 minutes. You don't have sunscreen, you don't have gloves, you don't have sturdy boots. You just have your hands, your aching body, and the hope that this year's harvest won't fail. Oh, and remember, you still have to pay rent for the land you're farming, land you don't actually own. But farming wasn't the only job. Towns were full of other unpleasant options. Blacksmiths worked in hot, smoky forges, hammering metal with sparks flying into their faces. Bakers woke up before dawn to fire up their ovens, often burning themselves in the process. Tanners had the worst of all. They prepared animal hides into leather by soaking them in urine and other nasty chemicals. The smell was legendary. If you were a tanner, people could smell you coming before they saw you. Want something even less fun? How about gong farmers? Their job was to clean out the cesspits, basically medieval toilets. Imagine climbing into a pit of human waste with nothing but a bucket and a shovel. That was an actual job, and while it paid slightly better than farming, the smell never left you. You could bathe in rose water, and people would still pinch their nose when you walked by. Other jobs weren't much better. Barbers doubled as surgeons, meaning they'd cut your hair and also cut off your infected leg, sometimes with the same tools. Millers ground grain but were often accused of cheating by taking too much for themselves. And then there were executioners, who had steady employment but probably not many friends. Children weren't spared from work either. From the moment you were old enough to walk, you were expected to help, gathering firewood, scaring birds away from crops, carrying water, or working as an apprentice in a trade. Childhood as we think of it today didn't exist. Playtime? That was a luxury. Even nobles worked, though their version of work looked different. If you were a knight, your job was to train for war. Hours of practice with heavy weapons, riding horses, learning tactics. It wasn't easy. If you were a lady of the manor, you were managing the household, overseeing servants, arranging food supplies, maybe doing embroidery for hours on end. Boring, yes. Easy? Not really. And remember, there were no weekends.
No paid vacations, no holidays, well, except religious feast days, which were more about church than rest. Work ruled your life, and it never truly ended. So let's compare. Would you rather sit in traffic on your way to an office, sip your latte while checking emails, and then complain about spreadsheets? Or would you rather shovel manure in the fields all day while praying your family doesn't starve this winter? Yeah, suddenly that office cubicle looks like heaven. In short, medieval jobs were dirty, exhausting, and often dangerous. But they kept people alive, and that was all that mattered. You worked because if you didn't, you and everyone you loved wouldn't survive. So, congratulations, you've made it through your first medieval workday. You're covered in sweat, your hands are blistered, and your clothes are filthy. And guess what? You get to do it all again tomorrow, and the next day, and the next, until the end of your life. Sleep well with that thought. So, after your long, back-breaking day in the fields, or maybe shoveling out a cesspit if you're especially unlucky, you stumble home exhausted, sore, and starving. Your stomach is growling like a medieval war drum. Surely, at least dinner will make up for it, right? Wrong. Let's talk about food in the Middle Ages, and why you definitely wouldn't be asking for seconds. First off, forget the idea of variety. There were no supermarkets, no restaurants on every corner, no late-night pizza deliveries. Food was whatever you could grow, hunt, or barter for. And for peasants, that meant your diet was, well, boring. Bread was the centerpiece of almost every meal. Not soft, fluffy bread, though. We're talking heavy, coarse loaves made from barley, rye or oats, gritty, dense, and sometimes baked with bits of dirt or husks still in the flour. Each bite felt like chewing a brick. Alongside bread, you'd get pottage, which was basically a thick soup or stew.
Sounds comforting until you realize it was just whatever you had on hand boiled together in one pot. Cabbage, onions, leeks, maybe a few beans, and if you were lucky, a small scrap of meat for flavor. The pot simmered day after day, and new ingredients were just tossed in as they became available. It was less like cooking and more like keeping a cauldron of mystery alive indefinitely. Meat was rare for peasants. Chickens, cows, and pigs were valuable alive, not on your plate. You couldn't just roast your only cow for Sunday dinner. That cow gave you milk or helped plow the field. So unless it was a feast day or an animal got sick and had to be slaughtered, meat wasn't on the menu. When you did get meat, it often wasn't fresh. Without refrigeration, preservation was everything. Meat might be salted, smoked, or dried until it was chewy and tough. Or it was cooked in strong spices to hide the fact that it was, well, a little past its prime. Bon appetit. Fish was more common, especially because the church had strict rules about fasting and avoiding meat on certain days. But again, fresh was relative. Salted fish, dried fish, pickled fish. You get the idea. If you lived near a river, you might catch something fresh, but otherwise it was preserved and far from tasty. Dairy products were part of the diet too, though mostly for children. Milk spoiled quickly, so adults often turned it into butter or cheese. But don't imagine smooth, creamy cheese wheels like today. Medieval cheese was often hard, sour, and crumbly. And drinks? Water was not always safe, especially near towns where waste ran into rivers. So people often drank ale or small beer, which was basically weakly fermented grain water. It was low in alcohol, so even children drank it. Nobles might enjoy wine, but it wasn't the fancy bottled kind. It was rough, sour, and sometimes watered down. And as for sweets, don't even dream about them. Sugar was a luxury so rare and expensive that only the richest nobles tasted it. Honey was the sweetener for most people, but even that wasn't common for peasants. Dessert was usually just more bread, maybe flavored with fruit if you were lucky enough to find some. Speaking of fruit and vegetables, they existed, but again, only seasonally. No strawberries in winter, no bananas at all. You ate what was grown locally, when it was ripe, and then you waited months for it to come around again. Preservation meant drying, pickling, or salting, so by the time winter hit, your fresh produce was long gone, replaced with jars of sour cabbage or wrinkled apples. Now let's flip to the other end of society, the nobles. Surely they ate like kings, right? Well, kinda. Nobles did have access to more meat. Venison, pork, beef, swan, even peacocks. Yes, people actually ate peacocks. Not because they tasted good, they didn't, but because serving one with its feathers reattached made for a dramatic centerpiece. It was all about showing off wealth. Noble banquets were feasts of roasted meats, pies stuffed with anything from pigeons to eels, and exotic spices imported at expense. But even then, the food wasn't always delicious. Preservation and cooking methods were still primitive, and spices like cinnamon, cloves, and pepper weren't used to enhance flavor so much as to disguise it. Bon appetit. And here's something funny. Utensils weren't really a thing yet. Forks were considered weird for centuries. People mostly ate with knives, spoons, or just their hands. Even at a fancy feast, you'd be tearing meat off bones with your fingers, then wiping your greasy hands on the nearest piece of cloth. Or maybe just on your clothes. Manners were flexible. So whether you were a peasant slurping down another bowl of cabbage stew, or a noble gnawing on a questionable roast bird, medieval dining wasn't exactly gourmet. Meals were about survival, not pleasure. Now imagine, you've been working in the fields all day, and the reward is a hunk of stale bread, a ladle of lumpy pottage, and maybe a weak ale to wash it down. You'd still eat it because you were starving, but you wouldn't exactly be taking food selfies for Instagram. So next time you open your fridge and complain that there's nothing to eat, while staring at shelves full of options, remember this. In the Middle Ages, you'd be thrilled to have even one of those choices. All right, so you've survived the day's work, you've eaten your bowl of cabbage stew, and now you're thinking, at least I can wash up and feel clean before bed. Ha! No. In the Middle Ages, hygiene was, let's call it, optional. And medicine? That was even worse. Let's start with baths. Spoiler, most people didn't take them. At least not the way we think of bathing today. Peasants rarely had the time, water, or facilities to bathe regularly. You might rinse your face or hands in a basin of cold water, but full-body baths were few and far between. Some people only bathed a few times a year. Yes, a year! Nobles were a little better off. Some castles and manor houses had bathhouses or tubs, and in cities there were public bathhouses where you could pay to soak. But even then, people worried that hot water opened the pores and let in disease. So cleanliness was often replaced with perfume, herbs, or just ignoring the smell. And speaking of smell, remember people lived with animals, used chamber pots in their houses, and walked through streets where waste was literally thrown out of windows. You could wash your hands all you wanted. The second you stepped outside, you were dirty again.
Now, let's talk about teeth. Toothbrushes, as we know them, didn't exist. People sometimes used cloths, twigs, or crushed herbs to scrub their teeth. But cavities were common, especially for the wealthy who could afford sweetened treats. Dentistry was basically yank it out and hope you don't die of infection. No Novocaine, no numbing gel. Just grit your teeth, well, the ones you had left, and scream. And illness? Oh boy! Germ theory wasn't a thing yet. Nobody knew bacteria or viruses existed. People thought disease came from bad air or miasma, or from an imbalance in the body's humors. Blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. If you were sick, a doctor might prescribe bloodletting, where they'd cut you open and drain some of your blood, because clearly too much blood was your problem. That never actually worked, but it stayed popular for centuries. Medicine was a mix of herbs, prayers, and superstition. A sore throat? Gargle vinegar. Headache? Tie a dead mole around your neck. Plague? Carry flowers to ward off the smell of death. Doctors weren't useless. They did know a few herbal remedies that helped, but for the most part, illness was a death sentence. Injuries were just as bad. Break your leg? Good luck. There were no casts, no antibiotics, no sterile surgery. Bones might be set crudely with splints, but infection could kill you faster than the injury itself. Amputations happened with a saw, no anesthesia, and maybe a strong drink to dull the pain. Survival rates were not great. And let's not forget childbirth. For women, giving birth was one of the most dangerous things you could do. No hospitals, no pain relief, and no understanding of germs meant infections were common. Many women didn't survive. Many babies didn't either. It was simply part of life. Even everyday sickness could be deadly. A cold might turn into pneumonia. A small cut could lead to sepsis. The flu could sweep through and wipe out entire families. And when the big one hit, the plague, well, we'll save that horror story for later. So let's picture you in medieval life. You're dirty, your teeth hurt, you've got blisters from work, and your doctor is telling you to swallow some ground-up earthworms to cure your cough. Meanwhile, your neighbor swears by carrying a dried toad in his pocket. Hygiene is minimal, medicine is questionable, and survival is basically a lottery. And yet, people managed. They got used to the smells, the sickness, the uncertainty. For them, this wasn't shocking, it was just normal. Which, in a way, makes it even more amazing that humanity made it through. So next time you grab some soap, brush your teeth, or pop a painkiller for a headache, remember,
You're living in medical paradise compared to your medieval ancestors. So, you've been stuck in your smoky little hut, eating bread that tastes like gravel, and you think to yourself, you know what? I need a change of scenery. Maybe a trip. Well, buckle up. Or rather, tighten your rope belt, because traveling in the Middle Ages was one of the worst ideas you could have. First off, there were no cars, no buses, no planes. If you wanted to go anywhere, your options were walk, ride a horse, if you were lucky enough to have one, or hitch a ride in a cart pulled by oxen. Spoiler, oxen move slower than a modern toddler being told to leave the playground. Most people never traveled far from their village. Why? Because it was dangerous. Roads were muddy tracks at best, full of potholes, rocks, and ruts. After a rainstorm, the road could turn into a swamp. After a dry spell, it became a dusty mess. And if you thought medieval shoes were bad for just standing in fields, imagine walking 20 miles in them. Blisters on blisters. But rough roads were the least of your worries. Bandits were a constant threat. Forget romantic tales of noble outlaws like Robin Hood. Most highwaymen were just desperate, hungry men with knives ready to take whatever you had. If you were carrying food, money, or anything worth stealing, you were a target, and there were no police patrols to save you. Speaking of danger, let's not forget wild animals. Wolves roamed the forests, and while they usually didn't attack groups of people, travelers walking alone could find themselves stalked. Bears were a risk in some regions, too. And wild boars, well, they were basically medieval tanks with tusks. Running into one of those was a nightmare. And if by some miracle you avoided bandits and animals, you still had to worry about getting lost. Maps were rare, expensive, and usually wrong. Signposts? Hardly any. Compasses? Not widely used. If you were lucky, you followed a river or asked for directions in each village, hoping the locals weren't messing with you. Now, maybe you're a noble with a horse. Congratulations! Your journey is a little faster, but not much. Horses still had to rest, and saddles weren't as comfortable as modern ones. Plus, horse care was essential. You needed feed, water, and stables. You couldn't just ride nonstop. And if your horse went lame halfway through, you were walking the rest of the way. Let's talk about inns. Sounds cozy, right? Wrong. Medieval inns were crowded, noisy, and dirty. If you could even find one along your route, you'd be sharing a straw mattress with strangers, and maybe their fleas, too. Food at inns wasn't much better than at home. Stale bread, watery ale, maybe a bit of salted meat. Luxury it was not. Now, you might think travel by water was safer. And in some ways, it was. Rivers were like medieval highways. Boats could carry more goods than carts, and sometimes faster too. But sailing wasn't easy. Storms could flip your boat. Navigation was poor. Pirates lurked along coasts and rivers, ready to rob you blind. Even crossing the English Channel was a gamble. Many ships didn't make it. And then there was the paperwork. Yes, paperwork existed even then. Lords and kings wanted to control who moved where, especially during times of unrest. Sometimes you needed permission to leave your village at all. Serfs, who worked the land, couldn't just decide to take a vacation. They belonged to the land, and by extension, to the lord who owned it. Travel wasn't just hard, it could be illegal. Religious pilgrimage were one of the few reasons ordinary people traveled far. Walking hundreds of miles to visit a holy site was dangerous, slow, and exhausting, but it was seen as a spiritual duty. Some people never made it back. Others spent years on the road. So let's imagine you set out from your village, hoping to visit a nearby market town. The road is muddy, your shoes are soaked. A bandit just stole your only coin, and now it's getting dark. Wolves are howling in the woods. The inn is full, so you're sleeping outside with one eye open. Suddenly, that cozy little hut back home, mud floor and all, doesn't seem so bad. In short, travel in the Middle Ages was dangerous, uncomfortable, and often life-threatening. No wonder most people stayed put. So next time you complain about traffic or airport delays, picture yourself trudging through mud, chased by wolves while clutching a piece of stale bread. Suddenly, a traffic jam feels like luxury. All right, so you've worked the fields, eaten your cabbage stew, avoided wolves on the road. Now what? You can't work all the time. Even medieval people needed fun. But here's the twist. Fun in the Middle Ages didn't look like Netflix binges, TikTok dances, or scrolling endlessly on your phone at 2 in the morning. Entertainment back then was a little different. Let's start with peasants. After a long day, they didn't exactly have energy for hobbies.
Most evenings were spent around the fire, if they even had one, telling stories, singing songs, or just sitting in silence while mending clothes. A lot of fun was practical. You might whittle wood into spoons, spin wool into thread, or repair tools. Things that needed doing but at least passed the time. Games existed, though. Simple ones, like dice or knucklebones, which was basically throwing animal bones and seeing how they landed. Children might play tag, chase hoops with sticks, or wrestle in the dirt. Not exactly Xbox, but hey, it kept them busy. Festivals were the big events. Religious feast days filled the calendar, and those were excuses to take a break from work. There'd be music, dancing, games, and sometimes even tournaments if you lived near nobles. Picture a village square filled with people drinking ale, juggling, and watching traveling performers put on plays or tricks. For a few hours, life felt less grim. Speaking of tournaments, if you were noble, jousts were a major form of entertainment. Knights suited up in heavy armor and charged at each other with lances while crowds cheered. It wasn't just sport, it was training for war, but dressed up as a spectacle. Dangerous, bloody, and loud, but undeniably thrilling. Music was everywhere too, though not recorded, obviously. People made their own. Lutes, flutes, drums, and bagpipes gave rhythm to dances and celebrations. If you had money, you could hire minstrels or troubadours to sing songs about love, war, or saints. If you were poor, you just sang yourself. And you better believe the songs stuck around, passed down through generations, long before Spotify playlists existed. Now, some entertainment was a little darker. Executions, for instance, were public events. Sounds grim, and it was, but people turned out in huge crowds. For many, it was both justice and morbid spectacle rolled into one. The same goes for bear baiting or cockfighting, blood sports that drew crowds eager for excitement. It wasn't pretty, but in a world with few distractions, it was something to watch. Storytelling was huge too. With few people able to read, tales were told aloud. Legends of King Arthur, saints' miracles, or local ghost stories to keep children in line. Around the fire, a good storyteller was worth their weight in gold. They were the medieval version of a Netflix account. Endless reruns of the same favorite tales, but no one complained. For the wealthy, entertainment included hunting. Deer, boar, and birds were all fair game. It wasn't just about food, it was about showing off skill, power, and status. Nobles would spend entire days riding out with hawks on their arms, dogs by their side, and servants trailing behind. Exhausting, but considered fun. And then there was gambling. Dice games, card games, which started appearing in the late Middle Ages, and betting on fights or races were common. People loved risking what little they had for the thrill of maybe winning and usually losing. Some things never change. But most evenings, they were quiet. Families huddled in the dim light of a fire, the sound of wind whistling through the cracks of their hut, and maybe a soft song or story before bed. Entertainment wasn't about flashy distractions. It was about surviving another day and finding a sliver of joy in the small things. So picture it. No Wi-Fi, no streaming, no phones. Just you, your family, a few bones to toss like dice, and maybe a song about some brave knight you'll never meet. Simple, yes. Boring, maybe. But for medieval folks, it was enough. And in a strange way, maybe that's why these stories stuck around. They were the glue that kept people going when life was hard. All right, so you've spent the day hauling wood or maybe watching knights knock each other off horses, and now it's time for dinner again. But before you dig into that chunk of stale bread and watery ale, let's talk about how people actually ate in the Middle Ages.
Because if you're picturing fancy silver forks and polite conversation, you might want to lower those expectations. First things first, forks weren't really a thing yet. People thought they were odd, even sinful. Why would you stab food with metal prongs when God gave you fingers? So most eating was done with your hands, with maybe a knife or spoon if you had one. Nobles sometimes owned cutlery, but peasants usually didn't. If you needed to cut your meat, you carried your own small knife, like bringing your own utensil to a picnic every single day. Plates, as we know them, also weren't common. Instead, people used trenchers, thick slabs of stale bread that doubled as dishes. You'd pile your stew or meat on top, let the juices soak in, and then either eat the bread afterward or toss it to the poor. Imagine your dinner plate being edible, but not in a fun taco shell way, more in a this bread is basically a sponge way. Now, manners varied depending on where you were. At a peasant's table, the rules were simple. Eat fast before someone else does, don't hog the bread, and try not to spill the soup. Nobles, though, had a whole list of do's and don'ts. Don't lick your knife. Don't wipe your hands on the tablecloth, though many did. Don't slurp too loudly. Don't reach across the table. Basically, they were inventing table manners as they went along, but the bar was still pretty low compared to today. Sharing was the norm. One cup might be passed around for everyone to drink from. One big pot of stew sat in the middle, and each person scooped out what they could. Double dipping, triple dipping, nobody cared. And let's just say hygiene wasn't exactly top priority. So you better hope your neighbor washed their hands sometime in the last week. And the food itself, as we've said, wasn't glamorous. But nobles tried to make it seem fancy with extravagant dishes, roasted swans with feathers reattached, pies that spilled live birds when cut open, yes, really, and meats dyed with saffron or spinach juice for dramatic color. Half the time, it looked better than it tasted. Drinks flowed too. Ale and weak beer were common, wine for the wealthy, and water only if you wanted to gamble with stomach trouble. Meals often stretched on for hours in noble courts, with entertainment, music, jesters, or even acrobats, keeping everyone distracted from the chewy meat and smoky rooms. But peasants didn't have jesters. They had whatever scraps they could pull together. A family huddled around a single pot, eating quickly before heading to bed. And bedtime came early, not just because they were tired, but because candles were expensive and you couldn't waste fuel staying up late. One thing both peasants and nobles shared, though, mess. Eating was messy. Food dripped, hands got greasy, clothes got stained, napkins were rare. Sometimes people wiped their hands on bread or on dogs sitting under the table waiting for scraps. Yes, dogs were the original medieval napkins. So let's set the scene. You're sitting at a wooden table, holding a hunk of bread in one hand and scooping stew with the other. You're shoulder to shoulder with family or strangers, maybe sharing a cup, maybe hoping no one sneezes into the pot. There's noise, chatter, slurping, and somewhere in the corner, a goat is bleating because it wants your food too. Not exactly fine dining, but it was life. Eating wasn't about savoring flavors, it was about filling your stomach so you could keep going tomorrow.
So next time you sit down at a clean table, with your own plate, fork, and napkin, maybe even complaining because the Wi-Fi went out during dinner, remember, at least you're not eating stew off of someone else's stale bread plate. If you lived in medieval times, one thing shaped your life more than the weather, more than the harvest, even more than your Lord's rules. That thing was the church. And when I say the church, I don't just mean Sunday prayers. I mean a whole system that stretched from the Pope in Rome all the way down to your village priest, touching every corner of your life from the cradle to the grave. Faith wasn't optional. Everyone was expected to believe, to follow, to fear, and to obey. Religion explained the world when science didn't have answers. Why did storms destroy the crops? God's will. Why did sickness spread? Sin, or maybe demons. Why was your Lord in charge? Because God said so. The calendar itself was built around the church. Feast days, saints' days, holy days. There were so many that people joked half the year was taken up by one festival or another. It wasn't just worship. It was social life. It was routine. It was identity. Mass was in Latin, a language most common folk didn't understand, but they still went. The ringing of church bells told you when to wake up, when to work, when to pray, and when to stop. They were the heartbeat of the village. But faith wasn't just about comfort. It was also about fear. People were terrified of hell, They were told again and again about eternal punishment for sins. The images painted in churches weren't gentle. Demons with claws, flames licking at the damned, souls dragged screaming into darkness. Scary stuff, especially when you had no other explanation for why bad things happened. The church also held immense power in everyday life. Priests baptized you at birth, married you, heard your confessions, and buried you at death. If you stepped out of line, you could be excommunicated, cut off from the church, which basically meant cut off from society and heaven itself. That was a nightmare scenario. And let's not forget indulgences. The idea that you could pay money to the church to reduce time in purgatory. Imagine fearing for your eternal soul and then being told a donation could shave off years of suffering. Comforting? Maybe. Exploitative? Definitely. But people paid because the fear was real. Monasteries were another piece of the puzzle. Monks and nuns lived lives of prayer, study, and labor. They copied books by hand, preserved knowledge, and provided charity to the poor. For many, they were the doctors, teachers, and historians of their day. Their libraries became treasure chests of wisdom in an age where most people couldn't read. And speaking of books, remember, the Bible was locked away in Latin, controlled by the clergy. Ordinary folk didn't get to read it themselves. They had to trust what the priests said. That gave the church incredible control over belief and behavior. Religion shaped art too. Cathedrals stretched skyward, stained glass windows glowing like jewels, reminding everyone of heaven above. Every sculpture, every carving, every hymn was meant to draw your eyes upward, to make you feel small and God feel immense. And in times of crisis, like famine, plague, or war, faith was the lifeline. People turned to prayer, pilgrimages, and relics, bones of saints, scraps of holy cloth, for protection. Some walked hundreds of miles barefoot to holy sites, believing it would save their souls. Of course, faith also fueled conflict. Crusades were called in the name of God, sending thousands off to fight in distant lands. Heretics, anyone who questioned church teaching, risked torture or burning at the stake. It wasn't a gentle institution. It was a force of fear and awe combined. Still, for the average villager, the church was more than rules and threats. It was community. Weddings, baptisms, holidays, markets, they all revolved around the parish church. It's where you saw your neighbors, where you sang, where you felt part of something larger than your tiny hut and muddy boots. So imagine it. The sound, the bells, and the morning mist, the priest's voice chanting in a language you don't understand, the smell of incense hanging heavy in the air. You kneel on cold stone floors, whispering prayers for your family, for your crops, for your very soul. Faith gave hope. Fear gave obedience. And the church made sure both stayed firmly in place. So, let's say you've had enough of your muddy village life and decide to hit the road. Maybe you want to visit a market in the next town, go on a pilgrimage, or, if you're very ambitious, travel across Europe. Sounds exciting? Well, before you pack your sack and grab a stick, let me give you a little warning. Medieval travel was not for the faint of heart. First off, roads were terrible. Calling them roads is generous. Most were little more than dirt paths that turned into swamps when it rained and dust clouds when it was dry. Bridges? Rare. You'd usually have to wade across streams, hoping not to slip or lose your shoes in the mud. If you were lucky enough to find a stone bridge, there was probably a toll collector waiting there demanding payment. Travel was slow. Walking was the default, unless you were rich enough to own a horse. Even then, horses weren't like today's shiny, well-groomed animals. They were working beasts, stubborn and tired, and riding them for long stretches wasn't exactly comfortable. Carts bumped and jolted over ruts, making every trip feel like you'd got a few rounds in a wrestling pit. But the real danger wasn't just the roads. It was who you might meet on them. Bandits and highwaymen were a constant threat. Lonely travelers were easy prey. If you were carrying anything worth stealing, money, food, even decent clothes, you could find yourself surrounded by men with knives demanding it all. The forest edges and remote valleys were favorite ambush spots. Even in groups, safety wasn't guaranteed.
Merchants often traveled together for protection, forming caravans, but attacks still happened, and if you fought back, well, let's just say bandits weren't exactly known for mercy. And it wasn't just criminals. Local lords sometimes acted like bandits themselves, charging tolls on roads that weren't theirs to control. Soldiers returning from wars might roam in gangs, shaking down travelers to survive. Basically, if you looked like you had anything valuable, someone wanted to take it. Nights were even worse. There weren't hotels on every corner. Inns existed, but they were few, crowded, and sometimes just as dangerous as the roads. You might end up sleeping on a bench in a smoky common room with strangers snoring around you, and if you woke up missing your boots, well, lesson learned. Many people slept outdoors instead, which came with its own risks. Wolves still prowled parts of Europe. Wild dogs scavenged near villages, and of course, the cold, damp night air could leave you sick by morning. Yet people did travel. Pilgrims walked hundreds of miles to visit holy sites, carrying little more than a staff and faith. Traders journeyed across mountains and seas to bring back spices, silks, and stories from faraway lands. Messengers rode long distances with news for kings. Life didn't stand still, even if danger lurked behind every hedge. Imagine it. The creak of wagon wheels, the splash of muddy boots and puddles, the shadows of trees leaning across the road. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell tolls, but between here and there is a long stretch of unknown. Every bend in the path could reveal a friendly farmer or a bandit ready with a blade.
So if you're thinking medieval travel sounds like a fun backpacking trip, think again. No comfy buses, no roadside diners, no GPS, just dirt, danger, and the hope you make it to your destination with all your belongings and your head still attached. If you ever get the urge to time travel back to the Middle Ages, let me give you one very clear piece of advice. Don't get sick, because once you did, things went downhill very fast. Medicine back then was, well, let's call it creative. People didn't have microscopes or a clue about germs or antibiotics. Instead, health was explained using the theory of the four humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. If you were sick, it meant these humors were out of balance. And the cure? Try to balance them again. How? Oh, bleeding you with leeches, making you vomit, or purging your bowels with strong herbs. Basically, anything unpleasant. Got a fever? Too much blood. Let's drain some. Feeling sluggish? Too much phlegm. Time for a hot, nasty drink to make you sweat. A stomach ache? Clearly your bile is out of whack. Better swallow this bitter concoction and hope for the best. Spoiler, it usually didn't help. Doctors were rare, expensive, and not always effective. Most people never saw one in their lifetime. Instead, healing was left to local wise women, midwives, or barber surgeons, the same guy who might cut your hair in the morning and amputate a leg in the afternoon. His tools? Knives, saws, maybe a cauterizing iron. Anesthesia? Nope. Just grit your teeth and hope you faint quickly. Herbal remedies were common. Plants like sage, mint, or garlic were used to treat everything from headaches to infections. Some of these actually worked a little. Garlic really does fight bacteria, but a lot of it was trial and error. You might get relief, or you might just get a new stomachache from the potion itself. Superstition filled the gaps. People believed illness came from sin, demons, or even witches. A priest might prescribe prayer, confession, or touching a holy relic. Pilgrimages to shrines of saints were popular. Maybe if you prayed hard enough at the right place, your sickness would disappear. And when the plague hit, like the Black Death in the 14th century, medicine was helpless. Doctors wore those creepy beaked masks stuffed with herbs, thinking the scent would block out the bad air causing disease. It didn't work. Millions died anyway. Surgeries happened, but survival was shaky. No sterile instruments, no antibiotics, no painkillers, just crude tools and strong stomachs. Broken bones were set with splints, abscesses were lanced, and sometimes teeth were yanked out with pliers. Imagine all of that without anesthesia. Not fun. Childbirth was especially dangerous. Women relied on midwives, prayers, and luck. Many mothers and babies didn't survive the process, and yet life had to go on, so families grew large, knowing not everyone would make it. But it wasn't all hopeless. Monasteries often kept herb gardens and tended the sick, providing some of the best care available.
Their records, written carefully in books, preserved medical knowledge through the centuries. And some remedies, like honey for wounds or willow bark for pain, were surprisingly effective. Still, for the average person, getting sick was terrifying. There was no clear cure, no guarantee of recovery, and no real understanding of what was happening. A cough could turn deadly, a cut could fester into infection, and if someone suggested bloodletting as a solution, well, you'd probably go along with it, because what else could you do? So imagine it, lying in a smoky hut, feverish, while your neighbor mixes a potion of garlic and wine, chanting a prayer as she ties herbs around your neck. Maybe it helps, maybe it doesn't. But in a world without modern medicine, you'd cling to any hope you could find. That was medieval healing. Part science, part superstition, and a whole lot of suffering. The sun has set, the fields are quiet, and the church bell has long since tolled. Work is done for the day, finally. But what happens when night falls in the Middle Ages? Let's step into the stillness of a medieval night. First of all, it was dark. Really, really dark. No street lamps, no glow from distant cities, no screens lighting up your face. Just blackness, broken only by the flicker of a candle, the glow of a fireplace, or the stars overhead. For people back then, night wasn't just time for rest. It was a force in itself, mysterious and dangerous. Most people went to bed early, not because they weren't night owls, but because candles and oil were expensive. Wasting fuel meant wasting food money. So as soon as the light faded, families gathered inside, prayed, and tucked in. Beds weren't exactly luxury. A poor family might all share a straw mattress on the floor, stuffed with hay, leaves, or wool if they were lucky. Nobles had wooden bed frames with ropes stretched across to hold a mattress, though those ropes needed tightening often, which is where the phrase "sleep tight" comes from. Sheets were rare, pillows even rarer. More often, you just wrapped yourself in whatever blanket you had and hoped the draft didn't freeze your toes. Privacy? Forget it. Most people slept with family, children, and sometimes even animals nearby, all for warmth. A cow in the corner wasn't unusual. Better a warm barn smell than frostbite. And here's a fun detail. People didn't always sleep in one long stretch. Instead, they often had first sleep and second sleep. You'd sleep for a few hours, wake up around midnight, pray, maybe chat quietly, and then drift off again till dawn. Night wasn't wasted. It had its own rhythm. But darkness brought fears, too. With wolves, thieves, or even spirits imagined to lurk outside, venturing out at night was risky. Doors were barred, fires banked low, and people trusted the night to pass without trouble. Superstitions ran deep. Dreams were seen as messages, owls were omens, and noises in the dark could send shivers through a bravest soul. For nobles, nights could be more comfortable. Big canopied beds, feather mattresses, curtains to keep out drafts. But even in castles, the cold seeped through stone walls, and the only defense was heavy blankets and a roaring hearth. Servants often slept right on the floor nearby, ready to stoke the fire if it died down. And dreams, those mattered. People believed they carried meaning, warnings, signs, glimpses of the divine. A strange dream could send someone to the priest for advice. Sleep wasn't just rest. It was another way to glimpse the mysteries of God's plan. So imagine it. The fire crackling low, shadows stretching across the wooden beams, and the sound of your family breathing softly around you. Outside, the wind howls, or maybe a distant wolf cries, but inside, you're huddled in the dark, clinging to warmth, drifting into uneasy dreams. That was the end of a medieval day. Not glamorous, not cozy by modern standards, but a pause, a fragile peace before the rooster crowed and the whole cycle began again.